Okay, so I'm going to now show you part two of our knit skirt that is just a pull on. So I've got a piece of stretch fabric here. It's got a good stretch lengthwise and widthwise. Width is from selvage to selvage. There's the selvage edges on that side. So a little bit about knits. You want to pick something that has a good stretch and recovery. By recovery, I mean when you stretch it and you let it go, that it goes back to the same size that it was. It doesn't stretch out and then just kind of sort of stay stretched out, and over time it will maybe ease back. What happens with stuff like that is it'll, when you bend your knees or if you're sitting, it will stretch out. It'll just hang funny. It's not going to look right. So when you're in the store, or if you're wherever you are and you're purchasing your stuff, always test it. Make sure it's got a good stretch and recovery. You also want to test and figure out which way your knit fabric has the most amount of stretch. 90% of the time, the greatest stretch is going to be going crosswise across the fabric. Okay, it's, if you think about when you're knitting with knitting needles, how you're knitting back and forth, so the loops in knitting form a little knit and purl. So when you stretch it, you get a bit of a line that goes up and down. You'll see that same line in knit fabrics when you stretch the greatest amount of stretch on this. You can't really see this, but there is a definite line going up and down on here. Now, knits, a lot of knits have stretch lengthwise too, and that's good. It's maybe not quite the same as the lengthwise or the widthwise stretch. Some lycra fabrics, the greatest amount of stretch is actually across the selvage. So you would cut your fabric, you would lay your fabric out and cut your pieces, this being your waistband, this being your hem, you would cut this way if it was a lycra fabric that had a great amount of stretch going across the selvage edge. It's all to do with how it's knit on the loom. So this fabric, I do know, has the most amount of stretch going across, which is where I want it. Remember, you've got a skirt here that has no opening for or closure. So there's no zippers, there's no buttons, waistband. The only way you're putting this on is you're going to stretch it to go over your hips, which are wider than your waist. So you're going to have to be able to stretch what your waist size is to go over your hips. So I'm just going to lay this fabric out. And this is just a lycra, and it's got a bit of a flocking design on it. You'll find all different kinds of lycras. Pre-wash, you don't have to pre-wash lycra or a knit as much. If it's got cotton or linen or silk, if it's that kind of a knit, yes, you definitely want to pre-wash it. Treat it just like your woven fabrics. Okay, so I'll get this so that we're all in the frame of the picture. Okay, so here's my pattern here. So I'm going to take my actual skirt pattern that I did up. So I've got this here. I've got all my information on it. This is my center front and center back grain line where the fold is. So what I want to do with this, I'm actually going to bring this up. I'll use this piece down below my hem for my waistband, so I'm not going to waste anything, is if you look at this pattern, you'll see that it actually has a direction to it. It's not like a stripe, but it definitely has a pattern. I want to make sure that I'm cutting this on grain. So the easiest way for me to find the grain of this fabric is to actually fold my pattern. This is where it's nice when you've got a whole pattern piece instead of cutting it on the fold. Fold my pattern, line it up so that the center front line lines up with the same point in each of these patterns on this fabric. And then I'm going to carefully hold it. I'm going to use a rotary cutter to cut this out, which you can do with knits. You can also pin. and you could cut this out. You could pin it and use scissors. I'm choosing to use a rotary cutter today. So I have a notch on either side here for my hip. I'm going to put those in just to give me an indicator when I go to line up the sides, because what I'll have to do is after I cut this, I'll actually have to flip and put my right sides together. Right now my right sides are facing out and my wrong sides together. The other thing I'm going to do is up here at the top, I don't have a notch up here, but I'm going to actually make one when I cut this out. So I'm going to cut this, keeping the rotary blade right along. I don't want to cut my pattern, but I want to keep my blade right along the edge of that pattern piece so that I'm cutting it perfectly. And just have a quick look at it. Make sure that you're good. I'm going to cut up the sides here. You see how this is much faster than pinning and using scissors. So I've cut up, so I've got a notch at the top. I'm going to go and cut along the waistband till I get to that center front fold line, and I'm going to put another notch there. That will just make it much easier when I go to put the waistband on. So now I've got to stand up on my table here so I can cut this other side out. So there, I've got my two pieces cut out. So you can see the advantage again of cutting your pattern piece or drafting your pattern piece on a folded piece of paper. So now I had one whole piece. I actually cut back and front in two or in one pass. Now if I didn't have this, if I actually had this pattern piece like so, and I only had half, this is a fold, what I would do, and I'll just move the fabric down, is I would have to, in order to save on fabric, I would have to actually open this up. So I'd have to roll off enough off the bolt or cut it. Actually, that's going to be the end of it there. So I would have to fold it on a fold. And same thing, I'd make sure that my fold line came along here. You have to make sure you fold it over far enough so that you're not catching your salvage in your side seam. So I would fold it, I would have this all flat underneath here. Definitely not cut with all that extra under. I would flatten it all out, make sure everything is straight. Cut one piece, and then I would probably go from the other side and fold it in again. So sometimes commercial patterns will have this layout in their pattern layouts. So you can see I've now got a fold over here and I've got a fold here. So I can cut one skirt on this side, flip it over, cut the back on the other. But like I say, if you've got the paper, then just as easy to fold that, make your pattern, then when you cut it out and you open it up, you've got a whole piece instead of cutting on the fold. So I've got my skirt pattern piece here. Only thing I have to do is take and put the right sides together instead of the wrong sides, and then I'm ready to pin it and take this piece to the sewing machine. I still have to cut out my waistband. So I've got this strip here and I've got it on the fold, so I can open it right up if that's as easy. Take my pattern piece, lay it down, make sure that I line it up so that if I've got a little pattern here, that my pattern is actually straight, because if I look at this, the way I've cut the last piece off, I'm on quite an angle. So I want to make sure that this pattern is going to be straight. So again, you could fold your pattern in half and just line that center up. Make sure that all of the pieces are showing it the same. Lay it out here. Put my weights down. I'll just pull this up so the whole thing is in the frame. So this, I'm only cutting one of these, okay? I don't have to cut two, I only am cutting one. This is going to be my waistband. So again, I'm going to cut my side, and I'm going to do the same thing here. When I come to what is the fold line that is my center front, I'm going to add a notch here. This is something you can do when you're doing your pattern making, or if you've got a notcher, you can put a little notch in your paper pattern here. So I'm just gonna pull these out of the way. So I've done a notch on both sides. You don't have to. As long as you've got one notch, you're good. So now my waistband is ready. The only thing I might want to do to it at this point in time is take it to the iron, and I could actually go ahead and fold this. Make sure your raw edges line up. So fold this in half and give it a really good press. So you've got a good crease here so that when you open it up, you can actually see the crease. We're going to need that when we get to, if we're going to put elastic in our waistband. So now our pieces are ready. I'm ready to take this to the iron, or to the sewing machine, and sew my skirt together. Okay, so we're at the sewing machine now. I have my skirt, my two pieces of my skirt. I'm pinning my side seam together, matching up that hip notch. Our seam allowances, we gave this pattern, were 3/8 of an inch. So that is the first line that I can see beyond my feed dogs on my sewing machine here. So I'm going to make sure that I keep everything lined up right there. Okay, so I've got my side seam all done. Now I'm going to set my machine up to sew. You've got lots of different options, I'm sure, on some of your machines for stretch stitches. I like to use something, especially on a side seam, which isn't going to have a lot of stress put on it, because it's going to be hanging straight. It's not going to be pulling and stretching to go around you. So I like to leave my stitch on a straight stitch, but over here on my machine, I can change the width of it. So I'm going to bring it to just not quite one width. So what I'm going to end up having now is just a slight zigzag. And I like to have my stitch length is 2.5. So for this will work out just fine. That way I have enough stitches over a short period of space, but with a little bit of a zigzag to it, not enough to make it too visible on the outside, but enough to give a little bit of stretch. So I'm going to line this up on my 3/8, and I'm going to start just inside of the top edge, and I'm going to take a stitch. I'm going to back stitch a little bit, and then I'm just going to stitch all the way down. Now I've got a stretch needle in here, and I'm using a 90 or a size 14 in a stretch. I find that's going to give me just enough stretch in my, or ability to have some stretch with my fabric here. A lot of machines work just fine with this type of sewing with a universal, but if you find that your stitches are skipping and they're not consistent, then you might want to switch and use either a ballpoint or a stretch. So I've just reversed it, and I'm just going to cut it. So I'm just going to show you, hopefully with the black thread, you can see my just a little bit of a zigzag. So here is the needles that I've used, just so you can see what they are. So that's a number 14. Schmetz is my preferred brand of needle. So now I'm just going to do same thing to the other side before we get to the waistband. So before I sew my waistband with the right sides together at the center back, I want to actually take it to the ironing board if I can. If I can't press my fabric, then I would probably just chalk the center, but what I want to create is a crease. Now we're going to see how this is a flocked fabric, so hopefully it doesn't come off here. So what I'm doing is I'm just pressing this down. I'm going to press all the way across this whole piece till I get to the end here. So I'm just giving this a good press. Pull this down a little more. So pressing it right to the end. So when I open this up, I've just faintly got a crease here. Now if you feel you're not going to be able to see that when you get it to the sewing machine, take a chalk and just draw a chalk line. What I've done as well is I've got just a narrow piece of elastic. This is just a 1/2 inch piece of elastic. So I'm going to sew it. I'm just going to overlap it by a 1/2 inch. I've cut it roughly the same size. Maybe this piece of elastic is about 1 inch smaller than my waistband. So I'm now going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew up my center back of my waist. I'm going to sew my elastic in a circle. Okay, so I'm back at the machine. I'm not going to worry about changing the stitch at all for overlapping. Sometimes I would want it just a little bit more of a wider zigzag, but what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to make sure I go across these two ends here a good amount. Okay, make sure that your elastic is in a nice circle. You haven't got a twist in it. I'm going to take my waistband. I've got it right sides together, my center back, the narrow side, 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to stitch, back stitch, the top and bottom. I didn't bother pinning this because it was just a short little area, but pin if you feel you need to. Okay, so now I've got my waistband in a circle. I've got my elastic in a circle. So what I want to do is I like to open up my back seam. If you need to, give it a press. If you don't, just leave it. I'm going to put where I've overlapped my elastic. Before I do that, I'm actually going to just take the chalk and mark the center of this elastic, just so when I get to the front, I'm even. So I'm going to lay this elastic right along the fold line so that when I'm going to stitch it down, I'm actually going to now change my stitch to a zigzag on my sewing machine. So, and I'm going to lengthen it so it's a little bit more of a basting. So I'm going to just take and make sure that this elastic is going to lay so that the top edge of the elastic is just butting the top, the fold line, so that what will happen is when this is folded over, on the right side, you won't see any stitching. On the wrong side, we'll have the zigzag, just securing that elastic in place so that when you put this skirt on, you don't have this piece of elastic moving all over, twisting all over the place. It just kind of anchors it in the right spot. So I'm just going to make sure that so I'm going to line these up, and this fabric has a very faint fold line, so hopefully I can kind of keep it on line. So you can see how I'm just lining it up. There's my fold, top edge of my elastic. I'm just going to line it up. I'm going to go all the way around this waistband. When I get so that I can actually see the center front, which is just over here, I'm actually going to take and kind of hold those in place. See how I have to stretch it just slightly? So I'm keeping edge of my elastic along the top edge. So here I am at the center front, and the center front of my elastic is right there. So keep going all the way around. I'm trying to sort of stay evenly on the same area as the elastic. I'm trying to kind of keep the edge of my presser foot and the bottom of the elastic sort of lined up. But now that I've said that, of course, it's going to go a little off kilter. Okay, so now I don't bother back stitching. I just go over my zigzagging a little bit there. So cut your threads. So now you can see where I have, let's find an area where, so you can see where I've got this. So now what happens is when I fold this in half, the elastic is on the back side. So this is now the wrong side of my waistband, and this is the right side. It just gives this skirt waist a little bit of guts to it. You don't have to put a waistband on or a elastic in the waist. If you don't want that, then just leave it out. Omit that step, and what you'll end up doing is you'll just be folding your fabric. Fold your waistband. I like to pin at the quarter marks. So there's my back. I'm going to pin my center front of my waist. So I'm just going to pin this down here. Now I can line up my center back and my center front. I can line those up and fold them. And now on this fold, I'm getting my side seam. So I can put a pin in here. Keep it folded. Keep these lined up. Go to the other side of your waistband. And I can put another pin right in here. So there I've got my quarter marks. Okay, so remember the side with no zigzagging on it is the right side. So now I'm going to take my skirt. So I've got the top edge of my skirt here. So I've got a side seam and a side seam. I've got the two notches. So unless you've cut your skirt at the back a little bit longer to compensate, if you've got a sway back and you need your back cut a little longer, then just decide which is going to be center front, which is going to be center back. And what you want to do is you want to take, I start with the center back. So I'm taking my waistband, and the right side of my waistband, the side with no zigzag visible, I'm going to line that up with one of my notches. And now I'm just going to take and I'm just going to pin those two edges together. I'm going to go to my side seam. Make sure that these are going to match up and stay together. So I'm going to go to my side seam here, side of my skirt. You can either fold that to one side or the other. You can open it up, whatever you choose to do. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to put a pin at my side. I'm going to go to the next notch and match that up with the notch on my waistband. So that's my center front. And now I just have to make sure that I match up my side seam on this side. So open up your seam. You can press this. The thing with pressing anything that's got any polyester or if it's obviously going to have some lycra or spandex in it. You don't want too much heat on that because if there's a rubber fiber in there, the more heat you put on it, the faster it deteriorates. Okay, and polyester is not like a cotton. A cotton, when you press it, will stay open. So that's generally why we either serge or we just fold our seam allowances to one side or the other. Now you see, I'm going to have to stretch this a little bit because my waist of my skirt and my waistband are not the same size. So I'm going to put the waistband facing up. I'm going to find the back. I'm going to switch my stitch back to that narrow zigzag and at 2.5. So I just have to find the center back here. And this pattern is making it a little bit hard to sort of see where there's actually a seam. Okay, so now I've got my waistband on the top, my skirt on the bottom. So what I see from the top is the wrong side of the waistband where the zigzag is. So I'm now going to take, and remember this is 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to zigzag. So you just want to make sure, this is where you can pin, but I find sometimes pinning just is a little bit too, it's just too much happening in here, and it makes it a little bit harder. We've only got a narrow edge here, so I'm just going to grab these 2 edges, make sure all 3 edges are sort of lined up, and I take it about halfway, and I'm just lining everything up so that all 3 edges are lined up along here. I'm stitching at 3/8 of an inch. You can use, if your sewing machine has a stretch stitch on it and you want to use the stretch stitch, you can use your stretch stitch. You don't have to use this zigzag. So I'm just now come to where my hand had grabbed hold, and I'm just sort of giving this top waistband just that little bit of a tug. So I've come to the next pin, which is a side seam. So I'm just going to bring this around again, give this a little bit of a stretch, line these all up. If this is a point where you feel you need to pin, you can take right now, while you've got it sort of stretched out evenly, put a pin in there instead of relying on holding it. But after time, you will get used to holding your fabric. Sewing with knits is just practice, and it's learning how to read the fabric and the stretch of the fabric. And I find if you're stretching one piece onto a piece that is smaller or bigger, it's always best to put the smaller piece on the top and stretch it to fit. It just goes through the feed dogs of your machine so much better, because the feed dogs move the fabric a little bit faster, so the longer piece will move and ease into the shorter piece a little bit easier if the longer piece is along the feed dogs. So there again, here I am with all this extra, so I'm just stretching it here. And actually, good point is to make sure your needle is down, just so it doesn't slide around. Make sure your needle's down, give it a good stretch so that everything fits. It shouldn't be a great amount. Mine is probably a little bit more because I don't have as much curve between my waist and 2 inches down, or I have a lot of curve. Okay, so giving this a little bit of a tug here, making sure that my edges are all lining up. So I'm just coming up to the side seam again. You notice how I haven't been pulling the pins out because they're clearing my foot. Just makes things a lot easier. So I'm going to do the same thing. Sure, my needle's down. If your machine has a function that keeps the needle down, where I'll put mine down, when it stops, it automatically stops in the fabric. That's always a good thing, especially when you are working with knits, so that you're not, see now, if I start pulling, my needle already is down. I don't have to remember to do that. So I'm just going almost to the edge. Okay, so bring your needle up. If you've overlapped your stitches, you don't have to back stitch. So I'm just going to go back around here and take out all of the pins that I've got in. Okay, so now when I flip my skirt out, you can see how I've got a nice waistband sewn on here. Okay, so last is the hem. So remember, I gave myself about 3/4 of an inch for the hem, so I want to just press this up at 3/4 of an inch. If you've got a little ruler handy, I've got a little guide here that I can find the 3/4 inch mark. Maybe I can find the 5/8 and I find the 1 inch. So I'm just kind of going a little bit in between so you can see. And this is metal, so I can actually press on it. Now, you've got a couple of choices. You can pin all the way around and just evenly pin this so that you've got it. Take it to the sewing machine. Sometimes knits tend to be a little bit, they tend to stretch out when you're trying to do a hem on them, especially because now we're working around the stretchiest part of the fabric, okay? I like to sometimes use just a fusible web. This comes in, there's different brands. Heat and Bond make it, Clover makes it. There's all sorts of companies that have it. So on one side I have paper, the other side I have a fusible web. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to press this. Now this works okay on this hem because I don't have a really curved hem, because as you can see, this is straight. So you put the web side down, and I'm just going to press along here. And I just keep pressing till I get all the way over. You want to make sure that before you touch it, after you've lifted your iron off, you give this a chance to cool down, okay? If you try lifting it or moving it around too much before it cools down, the glue hasn't had a chance to cool down and stick. What I've done is the web on the other side of this is a glue. So I've now put a glue on one side of my fabric. So you just have to keep moving this around until you get all the way around your skirt with your fusible web. So I've got this now. I'm just peeling off the paper, and you can't really see on this fabric, but the adhesive is now stuck to the bottom of my skirt. So I'm just going to peel this all off. I've let it cool down. So just make sure that some of it didn't stick to the paper. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this up on my 3/4 line, and now I'm just going to press my hem up, okay? So now I won't need to have any pins when I take this to the sewing machine. You still have to stitch it. Fusible webs, yes, they're washable. They do last for quite a bit. It is a temporary hold without a stitch, but I just use this more as something that makes it much easier. So what's happened is now my fabric's fused together, so it won't stretch out on me. It will stay nice and flat. So because I opened up my side seams at my waistband, I'm going to have to open them up down here at the bottom, getting all of this pressed all the way around. See how much faster and easier this is. Okay, so now there's my hem. And like I say, you could leave this. I still would be concerned that it might fall down, but now I can take this to the sewing machine. I can either take a twin needle, or I can just take my little zigzaggy stitch that I just had. You could put 2 threads in your upper, in your thread, to give a little bit more of a top stitching look to the stitch, or you can just do a straight stitch, because this is wide enough. This isn't this isn't going to stretch out when I wear it. So it doesn't need to have, it doesn't even need to have a zigzag stitch. A straight stitch is just fine. Okay, so I'm at my sewing machine, and I've actually got 2 threads coming down in here through the needle. So 2 threads acting as their one going down through my needle, 1 thread still in the bobbin, and I've got that little bit of a zigzag happening. So I'm just going to find a side seam. I like to do this with the right side up so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to stitch this at the 1/2 inch mark. So just take a stitch in, and I'm just stitching along here. Actually, I'm actually doing a straight stitch because I must have switched it over. So you can see how I've got just a straight stitch, but it's a little more visible because I've got 2 threads happening. So just keep your eye on it. Every once in a while, stop. Make sure that you don't have one of your threads bunching up or fraying. Sometimes that happens too. It just depends. Most of it is to do with the type of needle that you're using. So you can see, I just want to keep showing you how nice and flat my hem is. Okay, so here's my little skirt with the waistband. Actually, no, I did have it right. You can, like I say, you can barely see my seams in here. So here's my little slight A-line skirt. You can see my hem here. Everything is very, not very visible because of the pattern, which is great. But, so yeah, so now I have just a nice little skirt that I can put on with a red shirt or black or almost any color that goes with black and white. Anyway, that's our little pull-on skirt.